Thank you all for coming to this month's History at High Noon for Women's History Month. My name is Haley Aguirre. I am Archival Records Clerk here at the Sioux City Public Museum. But we are here to talk today about women in newspapers, both women who wrote for Sioux City newspapers like the Journal, as well as some women that have made themselves nationally known in newspapers across the country. I do want to mention a couple quick disclaimers before I get started here. I cannot possibly talk about every single woman who ever worked in the Journal newsroom, even all the reporters or the linotypists, stereotypists, composers, all of that. I can't talk about all of them. So this is just a small selection of all the incredible women that have made a difference in Sioux City's newspapers over the years. Even with the women I am covering, I can't cover all of the amazing things that they did. There's a lot of civil service programs that these women were a part of, as well as a lot of different groups and organizations that these women were a part of that unfortunately I don't go into because I just focus on their careers. So I do apologize for that, and if I miss somebody or if you can think of somebody, I can't cover everything. But I hope this will be a good overview of some amazing women in Sioux City's newspapers, as well as newspapers across the country. So whenever you talk about women and women reporters writing for newspapers, you have to talk about the society pages or the women's pages. Those two terms are actually different. They're not the same thing. Put this down. And I'll get into what that difference is a little bit. But society pages, women's pages, most people are familiar with those. And that's where most female reporters, especially early on, got their start in newspapers. So a bit of national background as to what these society pages and what these women pages are. The first recorded society column ever written for a newspaper was actually in the New York Herald in 1835. A reporter who was a man just kind of wrote some little humorous snippets about New York high society, New York aristocrats, and what they were doing at their parties. It was very much a humorous article. If you're familiar with the Netflix show Bridgerton and Lady Whistledown's writings about London's high society, it's very much something like that. That's what this was. And society loves laughing at itself. So this column became very, very popular in the Herald. Where it got more form and function is with a woman called Pearl Rivers. Now, her real name was Eliza Jane Nicholson, and she owned, operated, and edited the New Orleans Picayune, or the Times-Picayune as it was known later. In 1879, she started writing the Society Bee column, which, again, was just kind of the doings of New Orleans society, where people were going, what they were wearing, who had a party, who had a dance, so on and so forth. But rather than a humorous article, this was more just straight up reporting. And people loved this even more, so much so that by 1890, the society section was the largest section of the Sunday Picayune. So Pearl Rivers is fascinating, by the way. If you're interested in newspaper history at all, definitely go look her up, because she is one incredible lady. So I can't go too much into her because I want to get to Sioux City, but she's really fascinating. So what do these early society pages look like? Well, these are samples of the Picayune from 1891. That society column is right over there on the left of this broadsheet, and those two sample columns were taken from deeper in the society pages. So again, as I mentioned, it's a lot of doings of what's going on in society, what parties are happening, what fashion is happening, and what have you. This column, in a minor key, was all about the musical productions going on in New Orleans. And this green room gossip is about the theatrical productions that was going on in New Orleans. But I must address the elephant in the room. Like 98% of this paper is taken up by advertising. And publishers were started using these society pages as a key way to place female-oriented ads. In the 1890s and 1900s, women were making a lot more purchasing decisions, both for their families and for their households. So newspapers wanted a way to not only increase their female subscribers, but also get these ads into women's readers' eyes. That way, these ads that partner with these newspapers can get their products sold more easily. So it serves two purposes. It increases more female readers. As the society pages grow, it also increases their advertising. So what kind of news is going on in the women's pages? Well, the news was called soft news, just to distinguish it from the business and industry and other topics of the hard news of the rest of the paper. And it was centered in general around the 4 F's: food, family, fashion, and furnishings. So along with the social calendar and social goings-on, you also had stories about children. If Kenmore invented a new refrigerator that year, that was a story that was featured, so on and so forth. These are all clippings taken from the Sioux City Journal in 1912. Here you have the social calendar that appeared in every single Sunday edition. This clipping I took from a little story about the Fitzgibbons daughters and what they were doing with their family. And of course, in the front of the society page was a very large advertisement, usually from T.S. Martin's or Pelletier's, advertising new fashions, new furnishings, and all that good stuff. Now, in 2022, this idea of the women's pages and society pages is a little weird. I am not trying to argue that these women's pages were not marginalizing, because they certainly were, and marginalization of women is not okay. However, it's better than, number one, these women's interest stories not being told at all, because they were very important, especially in their time, and it's a lot better than these stories written with a male pen. These are 2 real examples from the Sioux City Journal in 1865, before there were such things as society or women's pages. And these are 2 wedding announcements. The one on the left here, some guy in the local area married a woman whose last name was House, and they are congratulating him for finding a house not made with hands. And then later they accuse him of housebreaking. On the left there, I couldn't find a good enough clipping for it. Unfortunately, when you're using scans of newspapers, they don't always come out very well. But on the left there is another wedding announcement, kind of a little bit disguised. Thomas E. Phillips of Sioux County married Rachel Dufrand of Elk Point in Dakota Territory before South Dakota statehood. And they congratulate him on making Sioux County's census more flattering. I.e., if you bring more women into Sioux County, it will make that county a nicer place to live. I get you were trying to make a joke, but that's also like, come on. So things like wedding announcements, fashions, social functions, they are important, and they were extremely important to the women, especially in their time, especially upper class women. So at least we can get away from this and tell things a little bit more with a feminine touch, shall we say. Speaking of the Sioux City Journal, a quick background if you're unfamiliar with the history of this paper. This talk is very journal focused just because it's very easily available via newspapers.com. I can cut and clip pretty much anything I want from the journal because the whole run is on newspapers, so that's pretty cool. The journal began in 1864, and in 1869 it was purchased by George Perkins. George Perkins here in Sioux City is who we commonly associate with the Sioux City Journal. This was a Republican newspaper, and it became a daily paper in 1870. By 1892, there were 2 editions of the journal published every day, a morning and an evening edition. In 1941, it merged with the big Democratic paper in Sioux City at the time, the Sioux City Tribune, and thus became the Sioux City Journal Tribune, which it was called until 1960, when it became just the Sioux City Journal again. In 1971, the paper was sold off to a non-local company called Sioux City Newspapers Incorporated, and so though the journal is still circulated today in both online and print versions, it is no longer published or printed locally here in Sioux City. So the first society editor for the Sioux City Journal, and from my research, the first regular society editor in Iowa was Elizabeth Perkins Bumler. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that last name. She was George Perkins' sister, and she came to Sioux City in 1869, the same time as she did. Now, her main gig, her full-time job, was a teacher at Sioux City schools, largely Sioux City High School, until she left Sioux City in 1903. But while she was teaching, while she was being a full-time teacher around 1882, she became the journal's first society editor. So she's pulling double duty, writing for a newspaper and teaching at the same time. So what is in Bumler's early society pages? Quite a lot, actually. Obviously, all those socials that I talked about, the teas, the luncheons, and everything. She reported on those. She also had to go to most of these events in order to properly report on them, saying, you know, who was wearing what, who was dancing with whom, and all that good juicy stuff that people wanted to know. So she's going to a lot of these events, teaching full-time, and prepping the society pages. Any club news, women's clubs were abound in Sioux City in the 1880s and 1890s, and so she had to report those club news. Any news going on in Sioux City's churches, if there were church council meetings, so on and so forth, those were covered in Bumler's pages. Any weddings that were going on, obviously. There was no other place in the journal at the time for obituaries, and so obituaries were also the responsibility of the society editor in these early days. Birthdays and birth announcements, comings and goings, who's leaving Sioux City, where are they going, are they visiting family, and who's coming into Sioux City, who maybe haven't we seen in a while, and who do we want to go visit while they're in town. Those things were reported in the society pages. There were news bulletins about music and theatrical productions, snippets of poetry and literature, and Elizabeth isn't just covering Sioux City in these society pages, she's also covering all the satellite towns around Sioux City, and anytime there's a big national news bulletin going on, she is covering those as well. So Elizabeth Bumler, and the society editor of the Sioux City Journal, is responsible for all of this. Oh, and some of these pages are really long, like this is a reception at the A.L. Hudson House, and some of them are just quick little notes and snippets, like this is what she has for Morningside in 1892. Not a ton of people living in Morningside yet in 1892. That would start to grow a little bit later. Some of the most popular stories of Bumler's era include the opening of the P.V. Grand Opera House, which began in 1888, and regular summer parties that occurred at the boat clubs in Riverside Park. This is a shot of the Riverside Boat Club in 1890. Look at all the hats. Love it. So after Bumler left, the journal had several different society editors. The one that would stand the test of time was Editha Kearney Webster. Now, she was born in Jackson, Nebraska, and she actually went to school to be a musician. She went to the Parker School of Music in Kansas City, graduating in 1916. She was hired as the Journal Society editor in 1927, and she served this position until her death in 1959. 30 years she devoted to the journal and its women's pages. So, what do Webster's society columns look like? Well, remember, starting in 1892, the journal had 2 editions every day, and so that's 2 daily columns that she has to prepare, usually just going on about the events of the day and getting ready for other events coming up in the week. And then most of her time was spent preparing a large Sunday section that was anywhere from 2 to 5 full pages. And you can see the front page of that society section on the left side there, or on the, sorry, my left, your right. And that's kind of what more people expect when they see society pages. Lots of photographs, lots of little news bulletins, so on and so forth. Now, Editha isn't writing or preparing all of this herself. She does have like a team of secretaries and reporters and what have you that are helping her, but she is the one who is organizing it, and she is the one in charge of getting it out in the paper every single day. During Webster's time, this was also the time to find critical reviews of art, music, and theater, so not just what's going on, say, at the Orpheum or the theaters around town, but actually reviews of some of these productions. Editha Webster was also considered one of the area's foremost experts on fashion. She made regular trips to New York City to attend the fashion shows, sent back pictures, and gave several public speeches across the country on fashion and styles of the times. She was so close with New York City's mayor, she actually helped plan the city's Golden Jubilee. She was on his special committee to help organize several different shows for that. So that's pretty incredible for a society reporter from Sioux City. Editha Webster also started the Women of Achievement Awards on Mother's Day in 1946. She started in every Sunday paper highlighting some woman who had made a particular civic or community service achievements in Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Minnesota. 35 different women were featured in this first series. Here is one she did on Lillian Dimmitt in July of 1946, who Dimmitt Hall in Morningside College is, of course, named for. And then on February 18th, 1947, she had what was called an Achievement Day, sponsored by the Journal, and it was a big reception and big celebration where all the women from that were featured in this Women of Achievement series were invited to Sioux City to attend this big event. And it was so popular, they kept doing it every year. Editha hosted it from 1946 until 1956, but it continued long after her tenure with the Journal. During the annual Achievement Day, one woman was selected among the nominees to be the #1 Woman of Achievement. The first to receive this honor was Mrs. Virginia Duell for her efforts in helping Sioux City's blind citizens. She started the blind shop that was associated with Goodwill Industries. Here you can see Virginia being interviewed by Don Stone of KSCJ, who was the host of the Journal's annual Achievement Day, and standing behind her is Editha Webster herself. The Women of Achievement is still definitely prominent here in Sioux City today. Its kind of spiritual successor, if you will, are the Women of Excellence Awards given out by the group Women Aware. And here's a shot of the reception at the Mayfair Hotel. In the Mayfair Hotel, there was always a big reception during Achievement Day. This is in 1953, so during every Achievement Day, not only were the new nominees invited to Sioux City, but all of the old nominees were invited to come back in as well if they could make the journey. So each year the group got bigger and bigger, and you can see how well they fill out the Mayfair Hotel here. So after Editha Webster, the Journal hired Helen Metz Benedict, if that Metz name sounds familiar. If you're familiar with Metz Brothers Baking Company in Sioux City, this is their sister of the two brothers. She was born in 1902, and she became the women's editor in 1959, and she served this position until 1970. I want to take my hat off to Helen Benedict. In the Journal's Centennial Edition that was published in 1964, she wrote a long history of the Society pages and the different editors that have been with the Society pages and how they've changed. So I want to congratulate her on that. That's where I did a lot of my research. Now, what do the Society pages start looking like in the 1960s? Well, as print changes, photographs get bigger, they get cheaper to produce. So instead of a daily column, now we have a daily page, usually called the Society page or the For Women section, so on and so forth. And then on Sunday, you had a much larger section that was, instead of 2 to 5 pages, usually about 10 to 12 pages, again, depending on the photographs and what's going on. What's in these Society pages? Well, of course, you have the general social beats, weddings, fashions, and church meetings. But during the 1960s, you see a large increase in not only photographs, but club news. Clubs dominated the Society pages of the 1960s. Fundraisers, volunteerism, anything going on, anything sponsored by the clubs, and as well as the different working women throughout Sioux City. All these stories became the norm of the 1960s Sioux City Journal Society pages. Benedict put it very, very well. Today, the fair sex is no longer interested in only fair matters. The page that you're seeing over here, this was a special in the Sioux City Journal, I think in 1966. Yeah, 1966. In their Sunday pages, they were talking about the increase of vocational training programs for girls going on at Central High School. Now, in the 1960s, you have another thing going on nationally, and you have the growth of what is called second wave feminism. This started in the early 1960s and kind of lasted up into the 1990s. Some people say it went beyond that. Some people say it wasn't that long. Historians never agree because we're difficult. But this was a push for more women's rights in the workplace and socially and legally, getting more rights for women. Some major achievements of this movement with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in cooperation with the Civil Rights Movement. This made it illegal for discrimination based on protected classes like gender and race. You also have the Title IX Education Amendment, which came about in 1972. This made schools around the country have to offer equal opportunities for education and extracurricular activities to both boys and girls. So this is most prominent in this is probably the growth of girls' sports starting in the early 1970s. So you have more women becoming active in society, more women becoming active in the workplace, and more women graduating with journalism degrees who are starting to say, what is going on with these women's pages? You know, why are women sequestered to a single section of the newspaper, as if you're making the argument that they don't care about things like business or sports or stuff that was considered hard news. And newspapers don't know what to do, because at the same time you have an older generation who are desperate not to lose these stories, desperate not to lose their social beats and fashion news and the things that they really, really care about. And so newspapers have to juggle both of these audiences simultaneously. So I do admire the Journal. I found this on several women's section pages in the Sioux City Journal. It's this little blocks of text that's maybe about this big right underneath their headline. And the Journal's like, oh no, it's not discrimination. We just call them the women's pages because women just seem to like them. But it's open to everybody. It doesn't have to be just for women. Which I like the argument, and I admire what you're trying to do, but at the same time, I'm like, if somebody has to tell you it's not discrimination, it's probably discrimination. Of course, the women's pages could not last in that political climate. And so around 1979, Jane Hun-Wardson, who had been hired as women's editor after Helen Benedict, saw the transition from the Journal's women's section into the living section. And today in the Journal, the living section is where you go when you want to find weddings, life stories, and so on and so forth. So that's the society pages. Now, of course, I do again recognize that the society and women's pages are marginalizing, and that is a problem. And I do want to recognize those women and those journalists who are breaking out of those society pages and breaking some glass ceilings with regards to journalism, as well as some of the major prominent figures that the Sioux City Journal has had over the years. So for some national background, the first women to kind of break out of these society pages were actually the suffragists of the 19th century, perhaps unsurprisingly in what is called first wave feminism. So you have women like Amelia Bloomer, who wrote The Lily, the first newspaper which was by and for women. Bloomer actually came to Sioux City during the women's rights movement, so that's pretty cool. You have Nellie Bly, an investigative journalist who wrote several famous books. She spent 10 days inside of a insane asylum to report on some of the horrible conditions and some of the things that were going on in that insane asylum. And you have women like Ida B. Wells, who was one of the first reporters ever, not just female reporters, but first reporters ever, to document some of the lynchings of African Americans that was going on in the American South. So she was one of the first people to print in a newspaper exactly what was going on down there, and how even after the Civil War, things were still hard for African Americans. So one of the first women I can find out of the society pages as far as the Journal is concerned is Louise Ludlam Baker. She was the granddaughter of George Perkins, the daughter of Florence Perkins Ludlam. And she was hired in 1916 to take care of the morgue. Now, if you're unfamiliar, as I was when I started researching this, the morgue files in a newspaper are the back files. So old clippings, old research notes, old interview notes that are kept away in an archive library and then accessed as needed by a librarian and then given to the reporter. So that's what she was doing at first in 1916, right out of high school. She was moved to the city desk in 1917, and she says that I only covered the ordinary events of the news, whereas anything major, anything important was of course given to the male reporters. But she was reporting in the city desk, which is pretty neat. She considered her report on the Rough disaster in 1918, where a building that was getting remodeled collapsed, killing 39 people. She considered that to be the turning point of her career. After 1918, she was hired to do the commercial beats. She had a regular column that focused on the market news of the Sioux City Grain Exchange. She also had many special assignments interviewing politicians and celebrities that came into Sioux City for various reasons. So like when John Philip Sousa came here to Sioux City to have one of his many concerts, she was sent to the Martin Hotel to interview him about his life and career and so on and so forth. Now, she got married to a businessman named Herbert Baker, and they moved to Zanesville, Ohio. And she, from what I gather, did not come back to Sioux City except for occasional visits. Ruby Westenhaver Hinchen. So if some of you may remember, in 2018, I actually gave an entire talk just on Ruby, which I hope prepares you for just how pioneering and how fascinated I am with this lady, because she is writing some really, really incredible stuff. I'll try to rein it in a little bit because I don't want to waste your guys' time. But she is quite the fascinating lady. She came here to Sioux City around 1920, and like Louise Ludnam, was hired as a city desk reporter. But Ruby is reporting things that are quite groundbreaking in her time. One of the first things you'll notice about her articles is the size. She gets a full broadsheet, not a little column. A broadsheet, by the way, is a page of newspaper. And she gets a full broadsheet and then some, filled with great pictures and using her own name. The next thing you might notice is the topics that she is writing about. Look at that headline, Prosperity of Sioux City Reflected in Its Banking Institutions. Not exactly fitting in the 4 Fs, which is what people thought that women were supposed to write and what women could write in the newspapers back then. Some of the language, which I've outlined on this slide, is also really cool. Total capital, surplus, and profits of the city's banks is given as 5,460,390. Capital, surplus, profits. These are not words that were common to female reporters in that era. This shows an immense gain during the 66 years since the first bank was started with only a few $1,000s of capital. So she's essentially telling hard news. And that's not something women in her time did, and especially not around here and around Sioux City. So it was pretty incredible that she's writing articles like this. But my favorite thing about Ruby is her talent of telling hard news softly. In every one of these articles, not only is she doing the standard reporting stuff of telling how much capital the banks have made, but she weaves in these little vignettes, these little excerpts, usually starring children. So the one she connects to the banking article is about 2 little boys who are haggling over the price of a puppy, and these 2 little boys learning the value of $1. And she weaves this into just pretty much what is a standard hard news article, as if she's reaching out to all the women of Sioux City who are in the newspaper saying, hey, I know you're reading this. I know they don't think you are, but I know you're reading this, and I want to make this as relevant to you as I can. Ruby also wasn't afraid to talk about women, and not even just high society women, but even poor girls, like working women. In this article, at about 1923, I want to say, she is writing about this working girl who she does not mention by name, and how hard it is earning a very, very low wage, much lower than the men in her position are getting paid, and having to go to the YWCA and spending those meager earnings on something to eat, and all the other expenses that she has to deal with as a working girl here in Sioux City. So she's not just, talking about the social events of high society. She's talking about your average working girls who also need attention in these city pages. Ruby also isn't afraid to show her teeth and make some social commentary all the time. This is my favorite article by Ruby. It is about the goats at the Stone Park Zoo who are getting their hair cut. Now, if you're unfamiliar, a woman cutting her hair short in the 1920s could get you ostracized, could get you totally kicked out of all of these social circles, and could even get you abandoned by your parents in some crazy cases. And so Ma Goat gets her hair cut along with all her daughter goats, and Pa Goat's not happy about it, and she just kind of pokes fun at him the whole time. Now, this is a really hot-button topic that she laughs at using goats. So it's this, and you see this kind of stuff all over her writing, so it's a really, really amazing piece of reporting in that time. In 1928, Ruby got married to Sioux City city engineer Leo Hinchen, and they left Sioux City so Leo could work with the WPA. She came back when Leo went to war during World War II and wrote for the Sioux Journal-Tribune starting in 1944. She wrote some feature columns like this shopping column over here, Roaming the Shops with Roma, and certain editorials for the Journal as well. Leo came back from war and they moved to Omaha in 1949 where they lived out the rest of their lives. So some of Ruby's editorials won some national awards. Her most prominent one was called American Patriotism, and she is writing not only as a woman who is waiting for her husband to come home from war, but what patriotism means, what that feels like, what that sounds like, what that looks like, and why it is so important for the people who are left here while World War II is going on. It actually won an honorable mention from a national editorial contest, so she was writing against both men and women editorialists at the time, and she won an honorable mention in that contest, so that's pretty amazing. Louise Flynn Zerschling, moving on to our next pioneer. She is a Sioux City native, born here in 1915, and starting in 1943, she worked for the Sioux City Journal until 1984. Over 40 years she was with the Journal, and during those 40 years, she worked in just about every newsroom position you could. So she worked at the city desk, she worked in the composition room, she worked in the editing department, she was a photographer for some time. If you can do it, and it was part of a newspaper, Louise did it. So Louise attended North Junior, Central High, and Buena Vista College, and wrote for the school newspapers of all of those institutions. Here you can see her on the staff of the Record in 1932, as well as on the staff in 1931 from that clipping there. In 1941, she went to the Austin, Minnesota Daily Herald, where she was the first woman reporter hired for that newspaper. She started in the society pages, but later moved on to write about sports, the police, City Hall, and the commercial beats as well. However, when she's writing about these hard news topics, she's writing under the pen name Lou Flynn, so as not to discourage her male readers. She returned to Sioux City in 1943 and went to work for the Sioux City Journal, and she became the Journal's first female sports reporter, police reporter, and photographer. The police reporter was especially important due to the fact that her husband, Les Zerschling, was on the police force, so that was especially relevant to her. And here you can see a couple articles written by Louise Zerschling. Louise Zerschling also had a passion for history. She wrote an article in 1981 on the demolition of the Combination Bridge and used photos from the 1890s Journal archives. We have copies of some of these photos in our museum archives as well. She also wrote the regular Out of the Past column, which she continued until her death in 1997. The Out of the Past column was essentially a on this day in history or in this week in history that pulled old headlines from and old journal stories from the past on that specific date. Louise's daughter, Lynn Zerschling, also worked for the Sioux City Journal from 1985 to 2013, rather. She covered a variety of topics, and her articles also won numerous awards. After her retirement, she continued the Out of the Archives column, which was the Out of the Past column renamed, until her death in 2019. Louise Sammons Fries, that's the third Louise, by the way, if you're keeping track. Louise was the granddaughter of George Perkins. She was the daughter of William Sammons, Perkins' son-in-law, who had been the publisher from 1914 until 1944. She went to Sioux City High School, graduating in 1915, and in 1921 she married a businessman, Herbert Fries, and they left Sioux City for a time for his business. She returned to Sioux City in 1939 and worked for the T.S. Martin Company for a little while. In 1943, she became commentator for the radio station KSCJ. This had been started in 1927 as the broadcasting unit for the Sioux City Journal. If you're like me and didn't know what those call letters stood for, KSCJ, Sioux City Journal, it was an embarrassingly long time before I actually figured out that that's what those call letters meant. But yes, KSCJ is called that because of its connection with the Sioux City Journal. So if you didn't know that, you're not alone. She began writing for the Sioux City Journal after the death of her father, William Sammons, in 1944. She was mainly known for two columns, the From the Bookshelf column, the book review column that she was the main editor for. She also was the timekeeper, which was the anonymous author of a column called The Hourglass. This was a variety column that spoke about art, philosophy, journalism, and a variety of topics. And she often included her own sketches in these Hourglass columns as well. So this little Christmas tree right there was actually drawn by Louise. In 1962, after the death of Will Perkins, who was George Perkins' son, she became secretary of the Perkins Brothers Company, the company in charge of publishing the journal. And she remained that until she retired in 1972. She died in 1975. Louise Fries was a frequent traveler, and she often wrote travelogue articles for the journal as well as her regular columns. She actually made a point to visit places that were undergoing a lot of political and social changes, like this article here, which is on Nasser's Egypt. She visited Israel 1 year after its statehood in 1949, and the article that she wrote from that visit won her an award from the Jewish community of Sioux City. Oops. Louise's daughter, Julie Fries Goodson, also worked for the Sioux City Journal, 1955 to 1974. I mostly know Julie Goodson from her time with the Castle on the Hill Association, which was a group formed to try to save the Central High School building, the Castle on the Hill. She did so much work for that organization that the gymnasium down in the dungeon of the castle has actually been named in her honor. It's called Julie Goodson Hall. Louise's sister, Elizabeth Sammons, also the daughter of William Sammons. She was born in 1903 and graduated from Sioux City Central High School in 1920. Unlike her sister, she never married. In 1940, she became programming director for KSCJ. And then in 1944, after the death of her father, she became secretary of the Journal Tribune Publishing Company. I lose track of, between Perkins Brothers and Journal Tribune Publishing Company, who's actually in control, because those names kind of changed frequently. But the company in charge of the journal and all the Perkins Brothers subsidiaries. This is an image taken in the home of William Sammons, and here in the front you can see Louise Fries sitting down. And in the far right on the back here is Elizabeth Sammons standing next to none other than Editha Webster. In 1954, Elizabeth Sammons became treasurer-director for the newly formed KTIV television station. The Perkins Brothers Company was involved in the formation of KTIV. Now, that was sold off with the rest of the Perkins Brothers subsidiaries around 1970, the same dates that the Journal was sold off, but she remained on the board of directors of KTIV until her death in 1955. Now, in 1961, when Will Perkins retired, Elizabeth Sammons became president of the Journal Tribune and the Perkins Brothers Company. She began publishing the paper starting in 1962. Now, she's in charge of the journal. That means she's also in charge of all of the journal organizations, like the Goodfellow Fund, which does the Little Yellow Dog auction, KSCJ, KTIV, and the Perkins Brothers Office Supply and Stationery Company. So she had a lot of things to handle as president of this company. When the paper was sold in 1971, as you can see in this article, the Perkins family had owned and operated the journal for 102 years. At the time, that was a national record. And the last one I want to cover as far as the pioneers go is Roberta Jolene Stevens. She was born in Grundy County in 1938 and went to Iowa State University. She actually visited the Sioux City stockyards with the livestock marketing class as part of her degree in agricultural journalism. She worked for various papers, including Red Lodge, Montana, Fort Dodge, and Spencer, Iowa, before she came to Sioux City in 1966. Now, Stevens is probably most famous for her time with the local news television radio station, so not print media, but television media. She was one of the original members of KMEG TV, which you can see here in this image of the KMEG crew right there. However, she also spent time at KCAU and KTIV. And you can see her on the staff of KCAU in that right image. Now, but as far as print media, in 1973, she became manager of the Livestock Market News Foundation. This was a foundation formed by the Sioux City Stockyards Company that was essentially responsible for getting all of the market news going on in Sioux City stockyards out to newspapers across the country. And so she was manager of that, so that was a pretty big deal. At the time, that was an immensely male-dominated field. Some of her other duties included posting regular newsletters like the Yards Highline, which you can see here. She also did a regular column for the Sioux City Journal called Yards Talk, which told about the goings-on, again, of the stockyards and the meat packers. Stevens left Sioux City around 1976 for West Des Moines. She worked in communications with the Iowa Cattlemen's Association and the National Pork Producers Council. However, in 1980, she came back to Sioux City and worked in communication with various companies, including Nutriflow, KD, and Goodwill Industries. Kind of a fun note about Jolene Stevens, she also was the first woman honored as an honorary firefighter by the Local 7 of the International Association of Firefighters, so that's pretty cool. Throughout her career, whether she's doing television news or print news, she is also writing a lot of freelance articles, often including her own photographs. Here are two that appeared in the Sioux City Journal. She also taught journalism at the University of South Dakota and several other schools, and spoke at many national journalism conferences. And finally, I want to round out this talk with some nationally famous Sioux City journalists. I know I'm kind of coming up on my time here, so if you do have to leave, I understand. But there's just a few women who were born here in Sioux City and made a name for themselves in papers all across the country. And you all knew this was coming. So, Esther and Pauline Freeman. These were twins born in Sioux City July 4th, 1918. They went to Central High School, where they graduated in 1936, and both attended Morningside College. They wrote a regular column for the Collegian Reporter, called the Campus Rat. It was essentially a gossip column. So the twins went to school together, they went to college together, they wrote together, and they got married together. They were married in a joint ceremony at Shar Zion Synagogue, July 2nd, 1939, and they even wore the same dress. Or at least very similar dresses, as much as I can tell from that clipping. However, from this point, though the twins are going into similar fields, their careers do diverge. So I'm now going to focus more on one at a time here. Esther Pauline Friedman married a man named Jules Lederer. He was one of the co-founders of Budget Rent-A-Car. They left Sioux City as Jules was a traveling salesman. They traveled all around the nation before finally settling in Eau Claire, Wisconsin around 1945. There, Esther got involved in politics. She served as the county chair in the Democratic Party, as well as part of the Anti-Defamation League in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Now, the Lederers moved to Chicago around in the early 1950s, and in 1952, she began working for the Chicago Sun-Times. She was an assistant to a woman named Ruth Crowley, who in 1941 had started the Ask Ann Landers advice column. When Crowley passed away in 1955, 28 applicants turned in samples and what have you to take her position, and Esther Lederer was the one who won out. She took over the column in October 1955. As Ann Landers, she received a reported 2,000 letters every single day, and she became known as much for her solid advice as for her very quick wit and charm. One of the things that set her apart from the other applicants and the other advice columnists was she was not afraid to consult experts whenever necessary. So if somebody had a question on, say, religion, she was not afraid to go to the local priest or to consult other people and to help answer these readers' advice. She also wasn't afraid to handle pretty hot-button topics of the time, like sex and divorce, and even homosexuality. She made regular trips around to wherever her column appeared. Here she is in Sioux City on a visit to Morningside College. She spoke at the college's President's Day. However, until 1988, the Ann Landers column did not appear in the Sioux City Journal. And to get into why that might be, I have to first talk about her sister. So Pauline Esther Friedman married Mort Phillips. He was an executive with National Presto Incorporated. That's a company that made air fryers. Here you can see them at a Presto convention in Florida. Pauline is right there in the center. The man with his arm around her is her father, Abraham Friedman, and Mort is over there all the way on the right, and she is sitting next to her sister Esther and Esther's husband, Jules Lederer. They settled in Eau Claire, Wisconsin for a while. However, soon they moved out to Hillsborough, California, which is right near San Francisco. Now, Pauline was dissatisfied with the advice column that was printed in the San Francisco Chronicle, and so she marched herself down to the office, typical go-getter fashion, and said, "Hey, I think I could write this better." The editor said, "Okay, here's a bunch of samples, write responses to them, and return them by 2 weeks." She went down to her husband's office, secured a typewriter at the office there, and returned all of the samples 3 hours later. She got the job. However, she needed to pick a pen name for herself, and she chose Abigail Van Buren. Abigail comes from the Old Testament, where David praises her for her sound advice, and Van Buren from the 8th U.S. president. She said she liked the aristocratic ring and sound to it. Thus, she became Abigail Van Buren, and the advice column became Dear Abby. Soon after it appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle on January 1956, it was purchased by the McNaught Syndicate, which made it national, imported to national newspapers all across the United States. The Dear Abby column first appeared in the Sioux City Journal starting October 29th, 1956. Time magazine called Dear Abby one of the fastest rising columnists in the business by 1962. She was receiving around 8,000 letters every week. She often used humor to answer her requests, kind of like her sister, who was known for her wit and charm. Her most common topics included love, romance, and marriage. She also made appearances around the cities where her column was featured. She made several trips here to Sioux City. In this photo, you can see her as she appears at the All-America City celebration in 1962. And on the right there, you can see her working in her home office as she receives the mountains of letters that come into her office to be answered. Now, I mentioned some controversy there. So there is several rumors that circulated going around about the twins, because obviously they were each other's biggest rivals. One of those rumors was the fact that Abby approached the Sioux City Journal and said, "Hey, if you run my column and not my sister's, I'll give it to you as a discount." Now, is there any truth to that? I don't know. If you're interested in some of that controversy and some of the rumors that were going on, I highly encourage you to read this book called Dear Anne and Dear Abby, published in 1987. Those biographers do a very great, thorough job of going into the twins' lives. And some of their professional careers. So if you're interested in that, definitely go check that out. I will tell you that they, whatever feud they did have, they publicly reconciled in 1964, and at least professionally, they remained on good terms from then on. Here you can see them at their 40th class reunion of Central High School in 1976. Esther and Pauline each wrote several best-selling books featuring some of the best of their advice column and appeared in numerous talk shows. Between the two of them, they had 22 honorary degrees, including one each from Morningside College. Over their long careers, they have been the subject of several biographies and television specials. A&E's biography featured a story on the twins. More recently, their stories have inspired a Broadway play. The play A Lady with All the Answers, which was written in 2006, was inspired by the life of Ann Landers, though also features her sister, Dear Abby, as well. And there's rumors, at least in 2019 there were rumors, that Natalie Portman was working on a film about these two sisters. So who knows what will happen after COVID, but definitely keep your eyes out for that, because that, I think, would be really incredible. So what happened to them and what happened to their columns? Well, Esther died in 2002. The Ann Landers column ended with her in July of 2002. However, readers were begging her editors, Kathy Mitchell and Marcy Sugar, to start up the column again. So in July of 2002, they started Annie's Mailbox, which ran until June 2016. On June 4th, 2019, Esther's daughter, Margot Howard, launched the website AnnLanders.com, which still exists, is still around, and actively gives advice in a wide variety of categories. As for Dear Abby, Pauline began co-writing the column with her daughter Jeanne starting in 1987. Jeanne took over the column fully in 1995 and continues as Dear Abby to this day. Pauline herself died in 2010 from Alzheimer's disease. And the last one I want to talk about, thank you guys so much for sticking around, Marianne Means. Marianne Means was born here in Sioux City as Marianne Hansen, and sometimes she splits her name up, though most of the time I see it squished together like that. She graduated from East High School in 1952, where she wrote for the Tomahawk. Here you can see her on the Tomahawk staff. She is on the front row far right there. Marianne Means went to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she graduated in 1956. Her senior year, she scored an interview with Senator John F. Kennedy, who had come to the college to speak at convocation. And she formed a very long-lasting friendship with him that would continue to influence her career as it went on. Shortly after college, she married a lawyer named C. Paul Means, and they moved to Washington, D.C. In 1960, Means was hired by the Hearst Headline Service, and she soon became a special correspondent to the White House. During the 1960 presidential campaign, she traveled all over the country doing interviews and following the campaigns of both Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, and she was even a featured writer at the Democratic National Convention, which you can see on the right side here. After Kennedy's election, she was hired as the only woman of the 16-member White House press corps. This is a shot of the press corps rooms, which you'll be familiar with if you've seen the television series West Wing. Newspapers frequently commented that wherever the president went, she went. So if he was going to Vienna to give a speech or a conference, she was there. If he was going to Paris, she was there. And she was also there on the train during, as part of the cavalcade down in Dallas when President Kennedy was assassinated. So yeah, she followed and reported the news wherever the president went. In 1963, she wrote a book called Woman in the White House. This featured profiles on 12 U.S. First Ladies, including John F. Kennedy's wife. She actually interviewed a lot of past presidents in order to write this book, and a lot of them commented that this is the first time they've ever been asked or even thought about what their wives did while they were president. She continued to write for Hearst during the 1964 presidential campaign and called Lyndon B. Johnson the most underrated of all our modern presidents. In 1965, she began writing for the King Feature Syndicate, so this was a subsidiary of Hearst, and she had a regular political column. This column regularly appeared in the Sioux City Journal and covered a variety of political topics, but she often talked about the plights of women in Washington and political circles around the world. She left King Features in 1994 and went to work for the New York Times until she finally retired from reporting in 2008. She died in 2017. And thank you guys so much. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope I didn't leave out too many important people. And most of all, I hope you learned something. And I'm happy to take any questions.